They say Mama Edna was so old, even the wind forgot to move her dress. A 103-year-old slave woman, small and quiet, left alone on a dying Mississippi plantation where time felt stuck and cruelty never aged. Everyone thought she was harmless, a fading shadow in the corner, but they never watched her eyes. Because when young Marianne was beaten bloody over a spilled pitcher, something inside Mama Edna snapped so hard it shook a century of memories loose. And one night, while the masters slept, that frail old woman moved through the dark with a purpose no one saw coming. By dawn, the Grayson family was dead, and every whisper on the plantation had the same trembling words: Mama Edna did it. But the real danger wasn't over. A new master arrived, Silas Grayson, a man who hunted lies the way others hunted animals, and he knew someone had planned those deaths. Now, the oldest woman on the plantation must outsmart the coldest man she's ever faced, before he discovers what she did, and burns everyone with her. Because this isn't just a story about revenge. It's the legend of what happens when a woman oppressed for 100 years finally says, "No more." Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The sun had not yet cracked the horizon when Mama Edna's eyes opened. She did not jolt awake. Her body no longer had the strength for sudden movements. Instead, consciousness returned slowly, like water seeping through cloth. The straw mat beneath her poked through the thin blanket, pressing into her hip bones. Everything hurt. Her shoulders, her knees, the small of her back where a whip had landed 40 years ago, leaving a scar that still throbbed when rain was coming. She lay still and listened. Around her, the other enslaved people began to stir. Footsteps shuffled across the dirt floor of the servants' quarters. Someone coughed. A baby whimpered until a mother's soft voice hushed it. The familiar sounds of mourning settled over the room like a worn quilt, threadbare but expected. Mama Edna's hands trembled as she pushed herself upright. The shaking was real now, not something she could control. Age had stolen the steadiness from her fingers. They looked like dried twigs, spotted and gnarled, barely able to grip the edge of her blanket. She blinked slowly, letting her vision clear, and saw the others moving past her without a glance. A young woman named Sarah stepped over her mat without acknowledging her presence. A man named Joseph carried a water bucket, his shadow falling across Mama Edna's face, but he did not pause. To them, she was already a ghost. Too old to work, too old to matter, too old to still be breathing. Mama Edna had learned long ago that being invisible was its own kind of freedom. When people thought you were useless, they stopped watching you carefully. They stopped listening when you spoke. They stopped worrying about what you might remember, or what you might do. She pushed herself to her feet, swaying slightly, and shuffled toward the door. Her legs barely cooperated. Each step felt like dragging stones across the earth. Outside, the air was cool and gray, the sky just beginning to lighten in the east. The Grayson plantation stretched out before her. Fields that had once been full of cotton now lay partially fallow, the war having disrupted everything. But the big house still stood at the center of it all, white columns gleaming even in the dim light, as if nothing had changed, as if freedom was just another lie. Mama Edna's mind drifted backward, the way it often did now. She was 103 years old. She had been born in 1763, before this country even called itself a country. She remembered things no one else alive could remember. She remembered her mother's face, round and dark, eyes sharp as obsidian, hands always moving, always working with plants and roots and leaves. They had lived in a village where the air smelled of rain and smoke. Her mother had been a healer, respected and feared in equal measure. She had taught Mama Edna the names of herbs, the way to crush them, the way to brew them, the way to know which ones brought sleep and which ones brought death. Mama Edna had been 12 when the men came. White men with guns and chains. She remembered her mother screaming. She remembered the ship. She remembered the darkness below deck, bodies pressed together, the stench of sickness and despair. She remembered arriving in a land that did not want her as a person, only as a thing to be used. That was 91 years ago. 91 years of survival. She had outlived 3 generations of Graysons. She had seen the first Henry Grayson build this plantation with blood and cruelty. She had seen his son continue it. She had seen his grandson, the current Thomas, inherit it like a crown made of bones. The Graysons believed their world would last forever. They believed God himself had ordained their right to own people, to break them, to sell their children like livestock. Mama Edna shuffled toward the well, moving slowly, deliberately. Across the yard, she saw children already at work. A boy no older than 7 carried firewood toward the kitchen. A girl, maybe 9, swept the porch of the big house with a broom twice her size. Their faces were blank, trained into submission before they even understood what submission meant. She had seen that look before. On her own children's faces, all 5 of them, taken and sold before they turned 10. She could still remember their names: Kwame, Amma, Kofi, Abena, Yaw. She whispered them sometimes in the dark, afraid that if she stopped saying them aloud, they would disappear completely. She did not know if any of them still lived. She did not know if they remembered her. She did not know if they had children of their own, scattered across this broken country, carrying pieces of her blood forward into an uncertain future. The door to the big house opened, and Thomas Grayson stepped out onto the porch. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a face that always looked angry even when he smiled. His wife Eleanor followed him, delicate and pale, her dress perfectly pressed despite the early hour. Behind them came the old patriarch, Henry, leaning on a cane, his white hair thin and wild. Thomas's voice carried across the yard. "Get those children moving faster," he barked at an overseer standing near the stables. "I don't care if they're tired. Work doesn't wait for laziness." Mama Edna kept her head down, shuffling toward the well as if she had not heard him. She moved like a woman who barely understood the world around her. She let her mouth hang open slightly. She let her eyes glaze over. She had perfected this performance over decades, the act of being so old, so feeble, so simple-minded that no one saw her as a threat. But inside, her mind was sharp. Inside, she remembered everything. The day wore on slowly. Mama Edna sat in the shade near the quarters, pretending to doze while the others worked. She watched Thomas Grayson pace the yard, barking orders, shoving a young man who moved too slowly. She watched Eleanor inspect the kitchen, her nose wrinkled in disgust at something only she could see. She watched old Henry settle into a chair on the porch, surveying his kingdom with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had earned everything he owned. Whispers floated through the quarters at midday. Someone had heard that freedom was real now, that the war had ended slavery for good, that they could leave if they wanted. But when a man named Abel tried to ask Thomas about it, Thomas had him whipped in front of everyone as a reminder that nothing had changed. The Graysons still held the power. The Graysons still owned the land. And as long as they owned the land, they believed they owned the people on it. Mama Edna said nothing. She sat and watched and remembered. As dusk settled over the plantation, the sky turning deep purple and orange, Mama Edna found herself alone near the quarters. Most of the others had gone inside to eat their meager rations. She sat on a wooden crate, her body aching, her hands folded in her lap. From the open window of the big house, she heard Thomas Grayson's voice rise in irritation. "These disobedient children," he snapped. "They think they can slack off just because the war's over. They need to be reminded of their place." Eleanor's softer voice responded, but Mama Edna could not make out the words. Mama Edna stared at the darkening sky. She felt something shift inside her chest, a tightness, a knowing. She had lived long enough to recognize the signs. Tension always built before violence. Silence always came before a scream. She whispered to herself, her voice so quiet it barely disturbed the air. "Something always breaks before a storm." The next morning arrived with the same gray light, the same heavy air, the same feeling of a world stuck in place. Mama Edna woke before dawn, her body protesting every small movement. She dressed slowly, pulling on the same faded dress she had worn for years, its fabric thin enough to see through in places. Her hands shook as she tied the cloth around her head, covering her white hair. She moved through the morning routine like a shadow, shuffling out to the yard as the plantation came to life around her. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, the yard was full of activity. Children carried water from the well. Men headed toward the fields with tools slung over their shoulders. Women disappeared into the big house to begin their endless tasks of cooking and cleaning and serving. Mama Edna made her way to a wooden bench near the edge of the yard, lowering herself onto it with a groan that was only partly exaggerated. She sat hunched forward, her spine curved, her hands resting on her knees. To anyone watching, she looked like a woman waiting to die. Thomas Grayson stood in the center of the yard, hands on his hips, surveying everything with the cold authority of a man who believed himself born to rule. He wore a clean white shirt despite the early hour, his boots polished, his hair combed back. He barked instructions at the overseer, pointing toward the fields, then toward the stables, then back toward the house. His voice carried across the yard, sharp and impatient. Eleanor emerged from the house wearing a pale blue dress, her hair arranged in perfect curls. She carried herself with the careful grace of someone always aware of being watched. A parasol rested against her shoulder, even though the sun had barely risen. She looked at the people moving around her yard the way someone might look at furniture. Necessary, but not worth thinking about too deeply. A little girl named Mary Ann followed Eleanor, struggling to carry a ceramic water pitcher almost as big as her torso. Mary Ann was maybe 8 years old, small for her age, with thin arms and wide, nervous eyes. She walked carefully, concentrating hard on not spilling, her bare feet moving slowly across the packed dirt. Mama Edna watched her from the bench. The girl reminded her of someone, though the memory sat just out of reach, hazy and painful. Eleanor stopped near the porch steps and turned, holding out her hand without looking back. Mary Ann hurried forward, lifting the pitcher to pour water into the cup Eleanor held. The pitcher was heavy, too heavy for such small hands. Mary Ann's arms trembled with the effort. She tilted it carefully, and water began to flow into the cup. Then her grip slipped. The pitcher tumbled from her hands and shattered against the ground, ceramic pieces scattering across the dirt, water spreading in a dark stain. Mary Ann froze, her eyes going wide with terror. Eleanor stepped back quickly, looking down at her wet shoes with disgust. "Thomas!" she called, her voice tight. Thomas turned, saw the broken pitcher, saw the water, saw the little girl standing there with her hands still outstretched. His face darkened instantly. He crossed the yard in 3 long strides, his boots crunching over broken ceramic. "You clumsy, worthless." He did not finish the sentence. His hand came down hard across Mary Ann's face, the sound of the slap cracking through the morning air. The girl fell sideways, landing hard on her hip. She did not cry out. Not yet. She had learned, like they all learned, that crying only made it worse. But Thomas was not finished. He grabbed her by the arm and yanked her upright, then struck her again. This time, she did scream, a high, thin sound that cut through everything else. He hit her a third time, then a fourth, his breathing heavy, his face twisted with rage that had nothing to do with a broken pitcher and everything to do with a need to dominate, to hurt, to prove he still held all the power. Mama Edna's vision blurred. The yard around her seemed to shift and shimmer. She was no longer looking at Mary Ann. She was looking at Amma, her second daughter, 6 years old, screaming as a white man beat her for dropping a basket of vegetables. She was looking at Edna, her fourth child, crying as she was dragged away to be sold because she had talked back to the mistress. She was looking at a century of children, her children, other people's children, children whose names she never learned, being broken for the smallest mistakes, for accidents, for existing in a world that hated them. The memories crashed over her like waves. Her mother's face, the ship, the first master who bought her, the years of work and pain and watching everyone she loved torn away, the decades of pretending to be weak, pretending to be stupid, pretending to be nothing because it was the only way to survive. Mary Ann collapsed on the ground, sobbing now, her small body curled into itself. Thomas stood over her, breathing hard. "Get her out of my sight," he snapped at a nearby woman. "Lock her in the shed. She can spend the day thinking about her carelessness. And tonight, she gets 10 lashes so she remembers." 2 women hurried forward to lift Mary Ann, who was still crying, blood trickling from her nose. They carried her away toward the punishment shed, a small building at the edge of the property, where disobedient enslaved people were taken to be whipped or locked in darkness for days. Mama Edna sat on the bench, her hands gripping her knees so hard her knuckles turned gray. Her lips moved, forming words almost too quiet to hear. "Not again. Not again. Not one more child. Not one more scream. Not one more century of this." The day passed in a fog. Mama Edna moved through it without seeing anything clearly. She ate nothing. She spoke to no one. She sat and stood and shuffled from place to place, her mind somewhere far away, somewhere deep inside where a decision was taking shape, like a storm gathering strength. When night finally came, she waited until the quarters grew quiet. She waited until she heard the deep, steady breathing of sleep all around her. Then she pushed herself up from her mat and moved slowly across the room, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. She knelt beside her sleeping area, her old knees protesting, and felt along the floorboards until her fingers found the loose one. She pried it up carefully, silently. Beneath it lay a small leather pouch, worn soft with age, tied shut with a thin cord. She had hidden it there decades ago, back when she still had the strength to plan for a future. Inside were herbs her mother had taught her about. Some she had gathered herself over the years, dried and preserved. Others she had traded for, bartered for, stolen when necessary. She had kept them hidden, kept them safe, waiting for a moment she could never quite define. Until now. Mama Edna clutched the pouch to her chest and stood, her whole body trembling. She made her way outside, moving like a ghost through the darkness. The moon hung low and full in the sky, casting silver light across the plantation. Everything was still. Everything was quiet. She stood in the yard, alone, the pouch pressed against her heart. Tears ran down her face, cutting tracks through the dust and sweat. She thought of Mary Ann. She thought of her own children. She thought of every person who had suffered here, every scream she had heard, every body she had helped bury. Her voice came out as a whisper, cracked and raw. "No more." The words hung in the night air, a promise and a declaration. The plantation slept. Darkness covered everything like a heavy blanket, broken only by the pale moonlight that filtered through the trees. In the main house, Candles had been extinguished hours ago. The Graysons lay in their beds, breathing the deep, careless breaths of people who had never known fear in their own home. Outside, crickets sang their endless song. An owl called from somewhere in the distance. The night air hung thick and humid, pressing down on everything. Mama Edna stood in the shadow of the servants' quarters, clutching the leather pouch. Her heart beat fast in her chest, a rhythm that seemed too strong for a body as old as hers. She had not felt this alive in decades. Terror and determination mixed together inside her, creating something sharp and focused. She knew what came next. She had known since the moment she pulled the pouch from its hiding place. Moving slowly, carefully, she crossed the yard toward the main house. Every step required concentration. Her legs wanted to betray her, to shake and collapse, but she forced them to obey. She had walked this path thousands of times over the years, carrying water, carrying food, carrying whatever the masters demanded. Tonight, she carried something else entirely. The back door to the kitchen stood unlocked. The Graysons never worried about locks. Who would dare enter? Who would dare challenge them in their own home? Mama Edna pushed the door open, wincing as the hinges gave a soft creak. She froze, listening. Nothing stirred. No footsteps above. No voices calling out. She slipped inside and eased the door shut behind her. The kitchen smelled of ash and old grease. Moonlight came through the window, painting everything in shades of silver and black. Mama Edna stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, letting her breathing slow. She knew this room better than any place on earth. She had worked here for more than 70 years, since the first Grayson patriarch bought her as a young woman. She knew which floorboards creaked. She knew where every pot and pan hung. She knew where Eleanor kept the tea, where the sugar sat, where the special tonic bottles were stored. She set the pouch down on the wooden counter and untied the cord with trembling fingers. Inside lay small bundles wrapped in cloth, each one containing dried herbs, roots, seeds. She unwrapped them one by one, spreading them out before her. Moonlight caught the different colors: deep brown, pale yellow, dark green. Her mother's voice came back to her across a century of silence. This one stops the heart slowly. This one makes the stomach bleed inside. This one brings sleep that never ends. The lessons had been taught in a language Mama Edna barely remembered now, in a place that felt more like a dream than a memory. But the knowledge remained, buried deep in her mind, waiting. She selected 3 different herbs, ground them together using the side of a heavy spoon, crushing them into a fine powder. The mixture smelled bitter, earthy, like something dead beneath soil. She worked slowly, methodically, her hands steadier than they had been in years. The tea kettle sat on the stove, already filled with water for morning. Eleanor always insisted on fresh tea first thing, before anything else. Thomas and Henry joined her most mornings, sitting in the dining room while enslaved hands served them. Mama Edna lifted the kettle's lid. The water inside sat dark and still. She tilted her hand, letting the powder fall in, watching it disappear into the liquid. She stirred it with a long spoon, making sure it dissolved completely, leaving no trace. Then she replaced the lid and set the kettle back exactly as she had found it. But she was not finished. On the shelf near the window sat 3 small glass bottles, Eleanor's special tonics. She complained constantly of headaches, of difficulty sleeping, of vague ailments that required special treatment. Last evening she had asked for a strong tonic to help her rest. Mama Edna had been ordered to prepare it. She reached for the largest bottle, uncorked it, and added more of the powder. This dose was stronger, more concentrated. She corked the bottle again and shook it gently, mixing the contents. The liquid inside turned slightly cloudy, but Eleanor would never notice. She never looked carefully at anything prepared by enslaved hands. Mama Edna stood at the counter, breathing hard now, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Sweat ran down her temples despite the cool night air. What she had just done could not be undone. There was no turning back. By morning, the Graysons would drink their tea. Eleanor would take her tonic, and then she gathered the remaining herbs, wrapped them back in their cloths, and returned them to the pouch. She retied the cord and tucked the pouch into the deep pocket of her worn dress. Evidence had to disappear. She wiped down the counter with her sleeve, checked the floor for any dropped powder, made sure everything looked exactly as it should. Then she moved toward the door. Her hand touched the handle. She paused, looking back at the kitchen one final time. The kettle sat innocent and waiting on the stove. The tonic bottles gleamed in the moonlight. Everything appeared normal. Everything appeared safe. Mama Edna slipped outside and closed the door behind her. She crossed the yard slowly, forcing herself not to rush, not to run. Running would draw attention if anyone happened to look out a window. She moved like she always moved. Old, tired, harmless. Back in the quarters, she lay down on her mat and closed her eyes. Sleep would not come. She knew that. But she had to at least pretend. She had to wait for morning. She had to see if the herbs would work the way her mother had taught her they would. The hours crawled past. She listened to the sounds of others sleeping around her. She listened to her own heartbeat, loud in her ears. She waited. Dawn came slowly, turning the sky from black to gray to pale blue. Mama Edna heard movement in the main house, heard doors opening and closing, heard Eleanor's voice calling for her morning tea. She pushed herself up from the mat and shuffled outside with the others, joining the early morning routine. She moved toward the kitchen, knowing she would be called to help serve breakfast. Everything had to appear normal. Everything had to look exactly as it always did. Inside the dining room, Thomas sat at the head of the table, already dressed for the day. Henry occupied his usual chair, reading a newspaper. Eleanor entered wearing a fresh dress, her hair already arranged. A young woman named Ruth brought out the tea service. Steam rose from the kettle as she poured 3 cups. The liquid ran dark and hot into the fine china. She added sugar to Eleanor's cup, nothing to the others. Mama Edna stood near the kitchen doorway, watching through the gap. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Thomas lifted his cup and drank deeply, not bothering to wait for it to cool. Henry sipped his more carefully. Eleanor brought hers to her lips and drank, then reached for the tonic bottle beside her plate, the one Mama Edna had prepared. She poured a spoonful and swallowed it, grimacing at the taste. "Bitter this morning," Eleanor commented. "You asked for it strong," Thomas said, not looking up from his plate. They continued eating, drinking, talking about the day ahead. Mama Edna watched every movement, every sip, barely breathing. An hour passed. Then another. The Graysons finished breakfast and went about their morning routines. Thomas walked out to inspect the fields. Eleanor sat in the parlor with her sewing. Henry remained at the table, reading. Then Henry's hand began to tremble. The newspaper slipped from his fingers. He tried to speak, but only a strange sound came out. He slumped forward, his forehead hitting the table with a heavy thud. Eleanor screamed. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her. She collapsed sideways, her sewing scattering across the floor. Out in the yard, Thomas fell to his knees, clutching his stomach. He vomited violently, then fell onto his side, his body convulsing. Chaos erupted. People ran in every direction. Someone was sent for the doctor. Enslaved women carried the Graysons to their beds, laying them out, trying to help even as confusion and fear spread through the house. The doctor arrived within 2 hours, a thin man with spectacles and a black bag. He examined all 3 patients, checking their pulses, listening to their breathing, looking into their eyes. He asked questions no one could answer. What did they eat? What did they drink? Had there been any illness in the house? Thomas died first, his body seizing one final time before going still. Eleanor followed an hour later, her breathing simply stopping mid-breath. Henry lasted until late afternoon, unconscious the entire time, his chest rising and falling slower and slower until it stopped completely. The doctor stood in the hallway, shaking his head. "I cannot determine the cause," he told the distant cousins who had been summoned. "Some kind of sudden illness, perhaps something they all ate. Food poisoning, possibly, though I have never seen symptoms quite like these." Throughout the house, enslaved people moved quietly, their faces carefully blank. They prepared the bodies. They cleaned the rooms. They whispered to each other in corners, in doorways, where white people could not hear. They did not know exactly what had happened, but they knew Mama Edna. They had seen the look in her eyes after Mary Ann was beaten. They had noticed her moving through the house the night before. They were not stupid. They understood. No one said anything directly. No one asked questions, but glances were exchanged. Small nods passed between people. A change had occurred. Something impossible had happened. And somehow, the oldest woman among them, the one everyone thought was half dead already, had made it happen. That evening, the bodies were laid out in the parlor, dressed in their finest clothes, surrounded by candles. The house had transformed into a place of mourning, though the grief felt hollow and strange. White neighbors would arrive tomorrow to pay respects. Arrangements would be made. The plantation would continue somehow, under new management, under new masters. Mama Edna stood outside in the darkness, looking in through the parlor window. Candlelight flickered across the three bodies lying still and silent. Thomas, who had beaten a child that morning for dropping a pitcher. Eleanor, who had watched without protest. Henry, who had built his fortune on the backs of people he considered property. All three were gone now, removed from the world by herbs and knowledge passed down from a mother who died before Mama Edna could truly remember her face. Mama Edna's lips moved, forming words only she could hear. "I did it." Her voice was barely a whisper, cracked and rough. "At 103, I finally did it." A faint smile touched her mouth, so small it was almost invisible. She felt something she had not felt in longer than she could remember. Not quite peace, not quite joy, but something close, something earned. She turned away from the window and walked slowly back toward the quarters, her shadow stretching long behind her in the moonlight. The morning after the Graysons' deaths brought an unnatural quiet to the plantation. No one quite knew what to do with themselves. The bodies had been prepared for burial, laid out properly, waiting for the funeral that would come in 2 days. Enslaved people moved through their routines mechanically, voices hushed, eyes watchful. Something had shifted in the air. The absence of the masters created a strange vacuum. Not quite freedom, but not quite the same captivity either. Mama Edna sat on a wooden bench near the quarters, her hands folded in her lap. She appeared to be dozing, her head tilted forward, her breathing slow and even, but her eyes were open just enough to see through her lashes. She watched everything, listened to everything, waiting for what she knew must come. Around mid-morning, the sound of wheels on gravel announced a visitor. A horse-drawn wagon rolled up the main drive, kicking up dust. The driver pulled the horses to a stop near the house. A man climbed down from the seat, tall, lean, dressed in dark clothing that looked expensive but practical. His face was angular, sharp-featured, with pale eyes that moved constantly, taking in every detail. Silas Grayson had arrived. Word spread quickly through the plantation. The extended family cousin, the one they sent for when things needed handling. Mama Edna had never met him, but she had heard stories over the years. Silas was known for managing troubled properties. He specialized in breaking resistance, in restoring order through whatever means necessary. Plantation owners called him when their enslaved people became difficult. He would arrive, stay a few months, and leave behind fear that lasted for years. He did not look like Thomas, who had been thick-bodied and red-faced. Silas was all calculation, all control. He moved with purpose, his boots striking the ground in measured steps. Within an hour, he began questioning everyone. He sat up in the dining room, sitting at the same table where the Graysons had eaten their final meal. One by one, he called people inside. He asked the same questions repeatedly, watching faces carefully, listening not just to words, but to the spaces between them. Ruth went first. She stood with her hands clasped, answering politely about the morning routine, about serving breakfast, about seeing nothing unusual. Silas watched her without blinking, then dismissed her with a wave. Isaiah came next, then Samuel, then the kitchen workers, then the field hands who had been near the house that morning. Each person told the same story. Everything had seemed normal until the Graysons suddenly fell ill. No one had seen anything suspicious. No one had heard anything strange. Silas listened to it all with an expression that revealed nothing. After the interviews, he walked through the house himself, inspecting everything. He examined the tea kettle, lifting the lid and sniffing inside. He checked the food stores in the pantry. He ran his finger along shelves in the kitchen, looking at the dust, at the arrangement of items, at anything that might seem out of place. He spent nearly an hour in that kitchen, opening cabinets, checking containers, studying the space like a man reading a book for hidden meanings. Outside, enslaved people exchanged worried glances, but said nothing. They continued working, heads down, trying to appear invisible. When Silas finally emerged, he walked directly to where several people were gathered near the well. His pale eyes swept across the group. "Where is the oldest one?" he asked. "I heard there was an ancient woman still living here." Someone pointed toward the bench where Mama Edna sat, apparently sleeping in the afternoon sun. Silas walked over and stood looking down at her. Mama Edna did not move. She breathed slowly, evenly, giving no indication she knew he was there. He stared at her for a long moment, then turned away. "Too old to know anything," he said dismissively. "Probably half-blind and completely deaf." He returned to the house. That evening, he gathered everyone in the yard. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground. Silas stood on the porch, elevated above the assembled group, his hands clasped behind his back. "I am Silas Grayson," he announced. His voice carried clearly, sharp and cold. "I will be managing this property until proper arrangements are made. What happened to my cousins was no natural illness. Someone in this household knows more than they are saying." He paused, letting the words settle. "I am a patient man. I will remain here as long as necessary to uncover the truth. Whoever is responsible will be found. Until then, new rules are in effect. No one leaves the property. No one travels to town. No gathering in groups larger than 3. Anyone caught lying to me will face consequences." He let his gaze move slowly across the crowd. "I have dealt with situations like this before. I know how to recognize deception. I know how to find truth. You would be wise to remember that." The announcement ended. People dispersed slowly, fear settling over the plantation like fog. Mama Edna shuffled back to the quarters with the others, moving carefully, maintaining the appearance of frailty. That night, after most people had settled onto their sleeping mats, Mama Edna heard a soft whisper near the doorway. "Mama Edna?" She recognized Isaiah's voice. She pushed herself up slowly and moved toward the door, stepping outside into the darkness. Isaiah waited there with Ruth and Samuel, their faces barely visible in the starlight. They walked together to a spot behind the quarters, far from the main house, hidden by trees. No one spoke until they were certain they could not be overheard. "Mama," Ruth whispered urgently, "that man, Silas, He is not like the others. He sees everything. He suspects everyone. He will not leave, Samuel added, his voice tight with fear. He said he is staying. What if he takes over permanently? What if he brings more people like him? Isaiah stood with his arms crossed, his expression grim. He talked about consequences, about finding whoever is responsible. Mama, we need to know. What happened? How did they all die at once? Mama Edna looked at each of their faces. Young faces, frightened faces. They deserved truth, even if truth brought danger. I killed them, she said quietly. The words fell like stones into water. I used herbs my mother taught me. I poisoned their tea and Eleanor's tonic. I did it because I could not watch another child be beaten. I could not live one more day under their hands. The three of them stood frozen, eyes wide. Ruth's hand went to her mouth. Samuel took a step backward. Isaiah's jaw clenched. You, Ruth breathed. You really? Yes, Mama Edna said. And now you know, but you must never admit it. Never speak of it. Not to Silas. Not to anyone. If he asks, you know nothing. You saw nothing. You heard nothing. Do you understand? They nodded slowly, still processing what they had just learned. He will hurt us, Samuel said. When he does not find answers, he will start hurting people to make someone talk. I know, Mama Edna said, but if any of you confess, he will kill all of us anyway. Silence is the only protection we have. They stood together in the darkness, bound now by shared knowledge and shared danger. In the distance, a light moved near the main house. A lantern swung slowly, held by someone walking the grounds. The figure moved methodically, pausing at different spots, examining the property. Silas. The lantern light came closer, moving toward the servants' quarters. The four of them pressed back into the shadows, not breathing, not moving. Silas walked past, just feet away, his boots crunching on gravel. He paused outside the quarters, holding the lantern up, looking at the building. His shadow stretched long and dark across the ground. Inside, Mama Edna had returned to her mat. She lay still but watched through a crack in the wall as Silas stood there, thinking, calculating. His lips moved. She could barely hear the words, but they reached her anyway. Someone here is lying. The lantern light swung as he turned and walked away, continuing his patrol. The glow faded gradually into the distance until darkness swallowed it completely. Mama Edna closed her eyes, but did not sleep. She had killed 3 people and freed herself from their violence. But now, a new threat had arrived. One who would not be fooled by her age. One who would dig until he found something. The real battle had only just begun. The sun barely cleared the horizon when Silas's voice rang across the plantation. Everyone outside! Now! People stumbled from the quarters, still half asleep, confusion and fear mingling on their faces. The morning air was cool, but no one felt it. They felt only the sharp edge in Silas's tone, the command that allowed no hesitation. Mama Edna moved slowly, supported by Ruth on one side. She shuffled into the yard with the others, her body bent, her steps uncertain. She positioned herself near the back of the gathering, hidden partially behind taller bodies. Silas stood on the porch again, but this time he was not alone. 4 white men flanked him, all armed with rifles. They wore rough clothes and hard expressions, patrollers, men hired to hunt runaways, to enforce discipline, to break resistance through violence. These men will be staying here, Silas announced. They will watch you. They will report to me. Anyone who steps out of line will answer to them. The patrollers spread out, taking positions around the yard. One leaned against a tree, picking his teeth with a small stick. Another walked slowly through the crowd, studying faces with open hostility. The third and fourth positioned themselves near the quarters entrance, blocking any quick retreat. Silas descended the porch steps. He walked into the center of the yard, his boots striking the dirt with deliberate force. Yesterday, I asked questions. Today, I will get answers. He stopped in front of an older man named Jacob, who had worked in the kitchen for years. You served the family their meals. You handled their food, their water, their tea. What did you put in it? Jacob's eyes widened. Nothing, sir. I only served what the cook prepared. The cook is dead, Silas said coldly. You are still alive. That seems convenient. I did not. Silas struck him across the face with the back of his hand. Jacob stumbled, but caught himself. Blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. I will ask once more, Silas said. What did you put in the food? Nothing. Jacob's voice cracked. I swear before God, I did nothing. Silas turned to the patrollers. Bring the post. Two of the armed men moved to the side of the yard where a thick wooden post stood, used for punishment. They dragged Jacob toward it. He struggled weakly, but they were stronger, younger, ruthless. They bound his wrists to the post, stretching his arms above his head. One patroller retrieved a whip from his saddle. The crowd stood frozen. No one dared speak. No one dared move. Silas addressed them all. This is what happens when people refuse to cooperate. When people hide the truth. When people think they can deceive me. The whip cracked through the air. Jacob screamed. The leather bit into his back, tearing through his shirt, opening flesh. The sound echoed across the yard, the snap of the whip, the cry of pain, the horrible wet impact of each strike. 5 lashes, then 10, then 15. Jacob's screams faded into ragged sobbing. His body sagged against the post, held up only by the ropes binding his wrists. Silas raised his hand. The whipping stopped. Take him down, Silas ordered. Let everyone see what resistance costs. The patrollers cut the ropes. Jacob collapsed into the dirt, barely conscious. 2 others rushed forward to drag him away, supporting his weight between them. Silas turned back to the crowd. Someone here knows the truth. Someone here committed murder. I will find them. This was mercy compared to what comes next, if my patience runs out. He walked along the line of people, studying each face. When he reached Mama Edna, he paused. She stood hunched over, her mouth slightly open, her eyes unfocused and distant. She swayed slightly, as if the act of standing exhausted her completely. What is your name, old woman? Silas demanded. Mama Edna blinked slowly. She did not respond immediately, letting confusion cloud her features. She does not hear well, sir, Ruth said quickly, standing beside her. Her name is Edna. She has been here longer than anyone remembers. Silas stared at Mama Edna with obvious disgust. How old? 103, sir, or thereabouts. Silas made a dismissive sound. A waste of air. He moved on without another glance. When the inspection finally ended, people dispersed in silence. The patrollers remained visible everywhere, watching, waiting, looking for any excuse to inflict more punishment. Mama Edna returned to the quarters with Ruth and Isaiah close beside her. Once inside, away from watching eyes, her posture straightened slightly. The confusion vanished from her face. We cannot stay here, Ruth whispered urgently. That man, Jacob, he will die from those wounds, and Silas will do worse. We have to escape. Now. Tonight. It is too soon, Mama Edna said quietly. He expects panic. He expects someone to run. The patrollers are watching for exactly that. Isaiah's hands clenched into fists. Then what do we do? Wait until he whips us all to death? Mama Edna's eyes were sharp despite her age. We prepare. Carefully. We make him think he is in control while we break that control piece by piece. She moved to the corner of the room, kneeling slowly beside her sleeping mat. Her fingers found the loose floorboard, pulling it up to reveal the small space beneath. Inside lay her pouch of herbs, a few other items, remnants of a life stolen long ago. As she touched the pouch, her mind drifted backward, pulled by memory into another time, another world. She saw her mother's hands, strong and steady, grinding herbs between stones. She heard her mother's voice teaching her the names of plants in their native language, explaining which healed and which harmed, which brought sleep and which brought death. She remembered the village, the sounds of children playing, the smell of cooking fires, the feeling of sun on her face when she was still free. She remembered being 12 years old, gathering water with other girls, laughing about nothing important. Then the men came, white men with chains, the screaming, the burning, her mother fighting until they struck her down, the darkness of the ship's hold, the smell of death and waste, the endless rocking of waves. She remembered arriving in this country, being sold like livestock, learning to hide her intelligence because smart enslaved people were dangerous enslaved people. She remembered her mother's final words, whispered desperately before they were separated forever. Remember what I taught you. Survive. And if you cannot survive as yourself, survive as a ghost. Mama Edna blinked, returning to the present. Her fingers still rested on the herb pouch. What did your mother teach you? Ruth asked softly, watching her face. Everything, Mama Edna said. How to heal, how to harm, how to appear weak while remaining strong, how to wait for the right moment. She looked up at Ruth and Isaiah. And she taught me that survival sometimes requires becoming something your enemy does not expect. Over the next hours, Mama Edna taught them small acts of sabotage. How to loosen screws so hinges would fail at inconvenient moments. How to add moisture to grain stores so food would spoil faster. How to frighten horses with certain scents so they would panic and bolt. How to weaken rope so it would snap under pressure. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just small disruptions that would build like water against a dam. That afternoon, a door in the main house fell from its hinges when Silas tried to open it. One of the patrollers' horses broke loose and trampled through the garden. Bread meant for the evening meal turned moldy despite being fresh that morning. Silas's frustration grew visible. He paced constantly, snapping at the patrollers, questioning people randomly, searching for patterns in chaos. As darkness fell, the disruptions continued. A lantern suddenly shattered. A window cracked for no apparent reason. Strange sounds echoed from the barn, causing the remaining horses to neigh frantically. Silas finally erupted. He stormed into the yard carrying a lit torch, his face twisted with rage. The patrollers followed, rifles ready. "I know what you are doing," Silas shouted at the darkness, at the quarters, at everyone and no one. "I know someone is undermining me. These accidents are not accidents. These coincidences are not coincidences." He thrust the torch forward, flames dancing violently. "I will find the traitor, even if it takes fire to smoke you out. Do you hear me? Fire!" In the shadows between buildings, hidden from the torch's light, Mama Edna stood perfectly still. She watched Silas rage and threaten, watched him wave the torch like a weapon, watched him spiral deeper into paranoia. Her expression remained calm, calculating, patient. She had survived 103 years by understanding when to hide and when to strike, by knowing how to break powerful men not through direct confrontation, but through small, persistent pressure. Silas thought he was hunting a traitor. He did not realize he was fighting a ghost who had learned to haunt the living. 2 days passed like slow water dripping from stone. The plantation continued its unraveling, piece by piece. Tools disappeared and reappeared in wrong places. Fence posts loosened overnight. Milk soured despite the cool cellar. Every small disaster fed Silas's rage, pulling his attention in a dozen directions at once. Mama Edna watched it all from her position of invisibility. The old woman, nobody noticed. The ancient body everyone assumed held nothing but fading memory and approaching death. She used that blindness perfectly. On the second afternoon, she gathered her small group in the back corner of the quarters, where walls met at odd angles, creating pockets of shadow even in daylight. Isaiah, Ruth, and Samuel huddled close, speaking in whispers that barely disturbed the air. "We cannot wait longer," Mama Edna said quietly. Her voice carried certainty despite its softness. "Silas grows more dangerous as he grows more frustrated. Soon, he will stop investigating and start executing. We move tonight." Ruth's eyes widened. "Tonight? But we need more time to prepare." "We have enough time." Mama Edna's gaze moved between them. "We have spent 2 days preparing without realizing it. Every moment of sabotage taught us the rhythms of this place. Every disruption showed us where the patrollers go, how they react, what pulls their attention away from us." Isaiah leaned forward. "What is your plan?" "Fire," Mama Edna said simply. "A fire large enough to demand every available hand. Chaos that forces the patrollers to abandon their posts and focus on saving property instead of watching people." She turned to Samuel, the youngest of the group, barely 20 years old with quick hands and quicker feet. "The granary. Can you reach it unseen?" Samuel nodded slowly. "Yes, I know the path. I can move through the shadows near the barn, cross behind the tool shed, and approach from the blind side where no lanterns hang." "Good." Mama Edna reached into her pouch and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside lay dried plant matter that looked like ordinary kindling but felt slightly oily to the touch. "This will burn hot and fast once lit. Place it in the corner where grain bags are stacked. The fire will spread quickly, but start small enough to give you time to escape." "When?" Samuel asked. 2 hours after midnight. The patrollers change positions then. There is a gap, barely 5 minutes, where the granary is unwatched. That is your moment." Ruth spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. "And the rest of us? We prepare everything now, during daylight, when preparation looks like normal work." Mama Edna's mind moved through details with practiced precision. "Gather food scraps. Nothing large enough to be missed, but enough to sustain us for 2 days of travel. Hide them in the spaces beneath your sleeping mats. Wrap them in cloth that will not rustle or smell strongly." Isaiah nodded. "What about the river path? I heard the patrollers talking about blocking the northern route after Jacob's whipping." "They blocked the obvious path," Mama Edna agreed. "But there is another route. Older, overgrown. I walked it 60 years ago when I first arrived here." Her eyes grew distant for a moment, remembering. "It runs along the eastern property line, where the land dips low. Trees grow thick there. The path is harder, but hidden." "How do we find it in darkness?" Ruth asked. "I will guide you. My eyes may be old, but my memory is not." Mama Edna met each of their gazes in turn. "Tonight, when the fire starts, move immediately to the eastern edge of the quarters. Do not run. Walk as if you are confused and frightened by the fire. Once you reach the tree line, I will be waiting. Then we run." The group separated to begin preparations. Each moved through the afternoon with careful normalcy, performing expected tasks while secretly gathering supplies. Ruth salvaged cornbread ends from the kitchen waste. Isaiah pocketed dried meat meant for dogs. Samuel collected strips of cloth for binding wounds or makeshift shoes. Mama Edna walked the grounds as she often did, her shuffling steps and confused expression convincing everyone she was simply a lost old woman who could not remember where she belonged. But her eyes tracked everything. She noted which patrollers stood where at different hours. She observed the rotation patterns, the gaps in coverage, the moments when men grew careless because nothing had happened for several hours. She walked past the granary twice, memorizing the exact position of shadows, the distance between buildings, the location of water barrels that might be used to fight flames. One patroller called out to her, Old woman, get back to the quarters! Mama Edna turned slowly, her face blank and uncomprehending. She mumbled something incoherent. The patroller waved her away, dismissively. Useless. Completely useless. She shuffled off, hiding the sharp calculation in her eyes. As afternoon faded into evening, the group ate their meager supper in silence. Around them, other enslaved people moved through familiar routines, unaware that some among them would vanish before sunrise. Mama Edna did not tell the others. Fewer people knowing meant fewer chances for betrayal, intentional or accidental. She felt the weight of that decision, leaving people behind who might also want freedom, but she carried it anyway. Survival required hard choices. It always had. Midnight came and went. The plantation settled into uneasy quiet. Lanterns dimmed. Patrollers yawned at their posts. The night stretched long and dark. 2 hours after midnight, Samuel rose from his mat. He moved like smoke through the quarters, slipping between sleeping bodies without disturbing anyone. Outside, he pressed himself against walls, using shadows as shelter. He reached the granary exactly as planned. The patrollers had just rotated. The blind spot opened. Samuel darted inside. The smell of stored grain filled his nose. He found the corner where bags were stacked highest, where the fire would spread fastest. He unwrapped Mama Edna's bundle and placed it carefully among the grain. His hands shook slightly as he struck the flint. Sparks caught. The dried plant matter ignited with surprising speed, flames crawling up the grain bags almost immediately. Samuel ran. Behind him, the fire grew. Smoke began to pour from the granary's ventilation gaps. Within minutes, someone shouted an alarm. "Fire! Fire at the granary!" Chaos erupted. Patrollers abandoned their posts, running toward the blaze with buckets and blankets. Silas emerged from the main house, shouting orders that contradicted each other. People scattered in panic and confusion. In that chaos, 4 figures moved quietly toward the eastern tree line. Mama Edna led them despite her age. Her walking stick became a tool of surprising stability, helping her navigate the dark ground. Ruth and Isaiah flanked her protectively. Samuel caught up moments later, breathing hard, but grinning with nervous relief. They reached the trees and plunged into darkness. Behind them, the fire painted the sky orange. Shouts and cries echoed across the plantation. But those sounds grew fainter with each step forward. The hidden path revealed itself slowly, more memory than actual trail. Mama Edna's feet remembered turns her eyes could barely see. They walked for hours, moving as quickly as her aged body allowed. When she stumbled, the others caught her. When her breathing grew ragged, they slowed until she recovered. Dawn approached gradually, turning the sky from black to deep blue to pale gray. They emerged from thick woods onto the bank of a wide river. The water moved lazily, reflecting the growing light. The group stopped, staring at the barrier between enslavement and freedom. Mama Edna stepped forward. Her walking stick touched the earth at the water's edge. She knelt slowly, joints protesting, and reached out with one trembling hand. Her fingers broke the surface. Cool water flowed around them. She closed her eyes and whispered one word: freedom. The water touched Mama Edna's fingertips, like a promise she never thought she would feel. For one perfect moment, freedom existed, not as a distant dream, but as something tangible, real, close enough to grasp. Then she heard the horses. "Move!" Isaiah hissed, grabbing her arm. But before they could take another step, riders burst from the tree line behind them. 4 patrollers on horseback, weapons drawn, faces twisted with fury. And at the front, sitting tall in his saddle with cold satisfaction in his eyes, was Silas Grayson. "I knew it," Silas said quietly. His voice carried across the riverbank despite its softness. "I knew someone would run tonight. Smoke and fire, chaos and distraction, primitive tactics, but effective if your enemy is stupid. He dismounted smoothly. I am not stupid. The patrollers surrounded them within seconds. Ruth grabbed Mama Edna's other arm, trying to shield her. Samuel stepped forward, placing himself between the old woman and the approaching men. We are leaving, Samuel said. His voice shook but held firm. The war is over. Slavery is finished. You got no right to stop us. Silas laughed, a short, sharp sound without humor. Rights? You speak of rights? He drew a pistol from his belt and examined it casually. Rights are words on paper. Power is what you hold in your hand. And right now, I hold all the power here. The law says we are free, Isaiah tried, though his voice lacked conviction. The law says many things. Silas's gaze swept over them with contempt. The law also says property must be protected. Thieves must be punished. Arsonists must face justice. You burned my granary. You stole supplies. You attempted to flee in the night like criminals. These are facts, not philosophical debates about freedom. He gestured toward the patrollers. Bind them. The men moved forward. Samuel stood his ground. No, I was not asking your permission. Silas raised his pistol. Run! Samuel shouted. He lunged at the nearest patroller, knocking the man sideways. His hands grasped for the patroller's rifle, trying to wrench it away. Mama Edna stumbled backward, Ruth pulling her toward the water. Isaiah moved to help Samuel, his fists swinging. The gunshot cracked through the dawn like thunder. Samuel froze. His hands released the rifle. He looked down at the spreading red stain across his chest with an expression of confused surprise. His knees buckled. No! Ruth screamed. Samuel fell. The water at the river's edge turned pink around his body. His eyes stared upward at the lightening sky, seeing nothing. Mama Edna felt something tear inside her chest, not physical, but deeper. Another life ended trying to protect her. Another person lost because she dared to fight back. The patrollers grabbed Isaiah and Ruth roughly, forcing their arms behind their backs. Iron shackles clicked shut around their wrists. They struggled briefly, uselessly. Silas walked slowly to Mama Edna. She stood alone now, hunched over her walking stick, breathing heavily. Her ancient body trembled from exertion and grief. He studied her for a long moment. You, the useless old woman everyone ignores. You did this, did you not? Mama Edna said nothing. She met his gaze without flinching. You killed them, my cousins. You poisoned the family. Silas leaned closer. You orchestrated all the sabotage. You planned this escape. A century-old slave with more cunning than I gave you credit for. Still, Mama Edna remained silent. Silas smiled. Your silence confirms everything. He nodded to the patrollers. Shackle her, carefully. Old bones break easily, and I want her alive for what comes next. They bound her wrists with surprising gentleness, as if afraid she might crumble to dust under rough handling. The iron bit into her thin skin. Her walking stick clattered to the ground. The journey back to the plantation passed in a blur of pain and exhaustion. Mama Edna's feet dragged. The patrollers half carried her, impatient with her slowness. Samuel's body lay abandoned at the riverbank, left for scavengers. Dawn fully broke by the time they reached the plantation yard. The granary still smoldered, sending thin wisps of smoke into the pale morning sky. Other enslaved people stood watching from the quarters, their faces reflecting horror and helplessness. Silas ordered Ruth and Isaiah chained to posts in the center of the yard. Their wrists were secured above their heads, forcing them to stand. He wanted everyone to see them. Examples, warnings. Where is the old woman? Silas demanded. The patrollers brought Mama Edna forward. She swayed on her feet, barely conscious. Silas grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him. Tell me the truth. Confess what you did. Give me the satisfaction of hearing you admit it. Mama Edna's lips remained pressed together, still defiant. Silas released her face roughly. We will see how long that lasts. He struck her across the face with the back of his hand. Her head snapped sideways. Blood appeared at the corner of her mouth. "Speak," Silas ordered. Silence. He hit her again, harder. She fell to her knees. "Speak!" Mama Edna's world narrowed to pain. Blow after blow landed on her frail body. Ribs cracked. Bruises bloomed across ancient skin. But she made no sound beyond involuntary gasps. Finally, Silas stepped back, breathing heavily from exertion. "Lock her in the old storage shed. No water, no food. Let her rot slowly. When she is ready to confess, she can call out. Until then, she suffers." The patrollers dragged Mama Edna across the yard. The storage shed stood at the plantation's edge, half collapsed and forgotten. They threw her inside onto the dirt floor and slammed the door. A heavy lock clicked into place. Darkness swallowed her. Mama Edna lay motionless, each breath sending fire through her broken ribs. Her body screamed in agony. Blood pooled in her mouth from split lips and loosened teeth. Outside, she heard Silas addressing the gathered enslaved people. "Look at your companions chained in this yard. Look at this shed where the old woman dies. This is what rebellion earns you. This is what defiance costs. Remember these lessons well." Hours crawled past. The sun climbed higher, turning the shed into an oven. Mama Edna drifted in and out of consciousness. Thirst became a living thing clawing at her throat. Pain pulsed with every heartbeat. She thought of Samuel's body at the river bank. She thought of Ruth and Isaiah suffering in the yard. She thought of a century of loss and grief pressing down on her like the weight of the earth itself. Had it been worth it? This rebellion that cost so many lives? Night fell eventually. The temperature dropped. Darkness deepened inside the shed until Mama Edna could not see her own hands. She stared upward at rafters she could no longer see, her vision blurred by swelling and tears. Then something caught her attention. A faint glow appeared near her left hand. She turned her head slowly, ignoring the spike of pain the movement caused. A tiny ember lay on the dirt floor, having fallen through a crack in the shed's broken wall. It came from a lantern outside, probably carried by a patroller making rounds. The ember glowed softly, a small point of red-orange light in overwhelming darkness. Mama Edna stared at it. Her broken fingers reached out slowly, trembling, and touched the warm fragment. She whispered one word into the darkness. "Not yet." The ember continued to glow. The ember pulsed between her fingers like a dying heartbeat. Mama Edna lay motionless for several moments, feeling its warmth against skin so old it had long forgotten the meaning of gentle touch. Her body screamed with injuries, ribs sharp as broken glass inside her chest, bruises spreading across flesh that had survived a century of cruelty. Blood crusted at the corners of her mouth. Each breath burned. But the ember lived, and so did she. Mama Edna forced herself to move. Her right arm pushed against the dirt floor, shaking violently with effort. Pain exploded through her torso. She gasped, but did not cry out. Giving Silas the satisfaction of hearing her suffer would be a victory she refused to grant him. She rolled onto her side first. The world spun. Nausea churned in her empty stomach. Her vision blurred, doubled, then slowly focused again on the tiny glowing coal in her palm. Sitting up took minutes that felt like hours. Her spine protested every inch of movement. Broken ribs shifted and ground together. Sweat poured down her face despite the night's chill. Finally, she managed to prop herself against the shed's wooden wall. Breathing in shallow gasps, the darkness pressed around her. Through cracks in the walls, she could see lantern light moving across the plantation yard. Patrollers making their rounds, ensuring no one else attempted escape. Mama Edna closed her eyes and let memory flood through her. She saw her husband, Marcus, strong hands that held her gently despite being forced to brutal labor all day, his smile when their first child was born, the way he sang low songs in the quarters at night, keeping hope alive through melody. She saw the overseer's whip cut him down for talking back, saw his body broken and discarded like trash. She saw her children, 7 born, 3 sold before they could walk, 2 dead from sickness the masters would not treat, 1 beaten to death for learning to read, 1 who simply vanished one day, taken to settle a gambling debt. She saw her grandchildren and great-grandchildren scattered across the South like seeds thrown into barren soil. Names she would never know, faces she would never see, bloodlines severed by the machinery of slavery, a century of loss, 100 years of watching everyone she loved destroyed by the same system that Silas Grayson now defended with such cold certainty. The rage inside Mama Edna was not hot. It did not burn with youth's passionate fury. Instead, it sat heavy and ancient, compressed under decades of forced silence into something dense as iron, something that could not be broken or diminished, something that would endure until it found release. She opened her eyes. Her mother's voice echoed across the years, speaking words taught in a West African village before the ships came, before the chains, before everything shattered. Even the oldest tree can still bring shade, her mother had said, grinding herbs with practiced hands. Or fire. Never forget, age is not weakness. Age is patience. Age is knowing which weapon to use and when. Mama Edna looked at the ember in her palm. Then she looked around the shed with new focus. The structure was old, forgotten, half collapsed. The floor was covered in dried feed that had rotted and scattered over years of neglect. Broken straw lay everywhere. In the corner, old burlap sacks slumped against the wall. She would not die quietly, not after coming this far. Moving with excruciating slowness, Mama Edna dragged herself across the dirt floor. Her legs barely functioned. She pulled with her arms, ignoring the fire in her ribs, until she reached the pile of dried feed. The ember had cooled slightly, but still held its core of heat. She placed it carefully among the driest stalks. Then she leaned down and blew gently. The ember brightened. Tiny wisps of smoke appeared. The feed began to char at the edges. Mama Edna blew again, and again. Each breath cost her dearly, but she did not stop. A small flame flickered to life. She fed it carefully with more dried straw, building the fire slowly. Too fast, and it would die. Too slow, and the guards would notice before it grew strong enough. While the flame established itself, Mama Edna reached beneath her ragged clothing and retrieved the small pouch still tied around her waist. Somehow, it had survived Silas's beating. Inside lay the last of her herbs, precious fragments of knowledge passed from mother to daughter, across an ocean and through generations. Her hands shook as she mixed them. Red powder from dried bark, yellow dust from crushed seeds, gray ash from roots she had harvested in secret years ago. Combined in specific proportions, they created something her mother had warned her about using. "This mixture confuses the mind," her mother's voice whispered from memory. "Makes men dizzy, makes them see things that are not there, makes them stumble and forget their purpose. But use it sparingly. Too much, and they die. Too little, and they simply sneeze." Mama Edna had no measuring tools, no precise instruments, only a lifetime of remembering and hands that still knew the feel of proper balance despite their trembling. She mixed the powder in her palm, testing its texture between her fingers. Not quite right. She added more of the gray ash. Better. The flame behind her grew steadily, consuming the dried feed with increasing hunger. Smoke began to fill the shed. Soon the guards would notice. Mama Edna turned her attention to escape. The shed's door was locked from outside, solid, impassable. But the walls were another matter. Years of neglect had loosened boards. Wind and rain had rotted the wood. Near the floor, she spotted what she needed. A section of wall where the lowest board had pulled away from its frame, creating a gap perhaps 2 feet wide. She crawled toward it. Her body protested every movement, but she forced herself forward. Behind her, the flame spread to the burlap sacks. They caught with a soft whoosh, and suddenly the fire doubled in size. Heat washed over Mama Edna's back. Smoke thickened rapidly. She coughed, tasting blood and ash. The gap in the wall loomed before her. She gripped the loose board and pulled. It shifted slightly. Not enough. She pulled harder, using strength she did not know she still possessed. The board groaned. Nails screeched against wood. From outside she heard shouting. "Smoke! The old shed's burning!" Footsteps ran past. Lanterns swung wildly. The alarm bell began its frantic clanging somewhere across the plantation. Mama Edna gave the board one final desperate yank. It tore free completely, and she tumbled backward into the dirt. The gap widened to 3 feet. Large enough. She shoved the herb powder into her dress pocket, then squeezed through the opening. Her broken ribs screamed. Her hips barely fit through the space. She scraped skin from her shoulders and arms, but she made it. Mama Edna emerged on the far side of the shed, away from the yard where patrollers gathered to fight the growing fire. She lay gasping in weeds and darkness, her entire body a constellation of agony. The stables stood 50 yards away, shadowed and quiet. She rose to her hands and knees, then, impossibly, to her feet. Her walking stick was gone, lost somewhere in the chaos. She used the shed's wall for support instead, then stumbled forward into the night. Behind her, smoke billowed into the sky. Flames leaped from the shed's roof. Men shouted instructions. Bells rang continuously. Mama Edna limped toward the stables, each step a small victory over pain and age and a century of oppression. Her shadow stretched long in the firelight, ancient and unbroken. She would not die quietly. Not yet. Smoke poured through the stable doors in thick black waves, choking and caustic. Inside, the horses screamed. The sound cut through the night. High, terrified whinnies that rose above the alarm bells and shouting men. Hooves crashed against wooden stalls. The animals knew what fire meant. They knew death approached. Mama Edna reached the stable entrance and paused, bracing herself against the doorframe. The heat from the burning shed washed across the yard now, creating flickering shadows that danced like demons across every surface. Patrollers ran back and forth with buckets, attempting to contain the blaze before it spread further. No one noticed the hunched old woman slipping into the stables. Inside, chaos reigned. 8 horses occupied the stalls, and all 8 fought their confinement with desperate strength. They reared and kicked, eyes rolling white with terror. Smoke drifted through the rafters above, growing thicker by the moment. Mama Edna moved along the row of stalls despite her injuries. Each stall door had a simple sliding bolt mechanism. Her arthritic fingers struggled with the first one, fumbling against wood worn smooth by decades of use. The bolt slid free. She pulled the door open. A massive chestnut mare burst past her so quickly, the wind knocked Mama Edna sideways. She caught herself on the next stall door, breathing hard, then continued. Second bolt. Third. Fourth. Horses exploded into the main aisle one after another, a stampede of muscle and panic. They crashed through the stable's open entrance into the yard beyond. Someone shouted, "The horses! They're loose!" Mama Edna freed the 5th and 6th animals. A gray gelding nearly trampled her in his rush for freedom. She pressed herself flat against the wall, feeling his body heat as he thundered past. 7th stall. The bolt stuck. She yanked harder, ignoring the pain shooting through her wrists. It gave way suddenly, and she stumbled. The horse inside, a young black stallion, charged out with such force that his shoulder clipped Mama Edna and sent her sprawling into the dirt and straw. She lay there, gasping, tasting blood and smoke, while the stallion vanished into the night. One stall remained. Mama Edna crawled to it on hands and knees. The last horse, an old plow mare, stood trembling inside. Unlike the others, she did not bolt when Mama Edna opened the door. Instead, she stepped out carefully, then lowered her head and nuzzled Mama Edna's shoulder once before walking calmly away. A strange moment of gentleness in the chaos. Outside, absolute pandemonium had erupted. The freed horses scattered across the plantation yard, crashing through vegetable gardens, knocking over barrels, disrupting every attempt at organized firefighting. Men ran in all directions. Someone fired a gun, trying to control the animals, which only made them more frantic. Mama Edna pulled herself upright using the stable wall. Her legs barely held her weight, but she forced them to work. One more task remained before she could rest. She limped toward the main house, circling wide through shadows to avoid the firelit central yard. The herb powder in her pocket felt heavier than its actual weight, the accumulated knowledge of generations compressed into a few ounces of dust. The kitchen entrance stood at the house's rear, accessible through a small covered walkway. Two patrollers had positioned themselves near it, guarding against potential looters during the confusion. They coughed repeatedly, eyes watering from the smoke drifting across the plantation. Mama Edna crept closer, using the darkness between buildings as cover. When she reached the walkway, she removed the pouch from her pocket and loosened its drawstring. The kitchen door hung slightly ajar, left open when servants fled the chaos earlier. Perfect. Mama Edna waited until both guards turned away, watching another loose horse gallop past. Then she slipped through the doorway into familiar territory. The kitchen where she had poisoned the Graysons weeks earlier. The same room where she had spent decades preparing meals for masters who viewed her as less than human. Every surface held memories of humiliation and servitude. She moved through it now as something else entirely. Not servant, not victim, executioner. Mama Edna scattered the herb powder across the floor in a wide arc, concentrating it near the entrance and along the pathway to the main house. The gray-yellow dust settled invisibly into cracks and corners. Then she sprinkled a handful on the kitchen table where lanterns burned, knowing the heat would carry particles into the air. Voices approached from the yard. Footsteps on wooden steps. Mama Edna retreated behind the pantry door, just as three patrollers burst into the kitchen, coughing and shouting instructions to each other. They grabbed buckets, rope, anything useful for fighting the fire. Within seconds, their coughing intensified. One man rubbed his eyes, cursing. Another stumbled against the table, suddenly dizzy. The third bent double, wheezing and confused. "Something's wrong," one gasped. Can't breathe right." They staggered back outside, disoriented and useless. Through the pantry's crack, Mama Edna watched them go. The powder worked faster than expected. Good. She emerged from hiding and made her way through the kitchen to the yard's edge. The fire had grown substantially. Flames consumed the entire shed now and licked at a nearby storage building. Orange light painted everything in hellish shades. Near the quarters, she spotted Ruth and Isaiah moving through the chaos with purpose. They worked together, using tools to break the chains holding other enslaved people in the yard. Silas had ordered them shackled after the failed escape, intending to make examples of them at dawn. Instead, they slipped free one by one, disappearing into the confusion of smoke and frightened horses and disoriented guards. Ruth saw Mama Edna, and their eyes met across the firelit distance. Ruth's expression showed shock, She had believed Mama Edna dead or dying in the locked shed. Mama Edna nodded once. Keep going. Save them. Ruth understood. She turned back to freeing the others. A voice cut through the chaos like a whip crack. Enough! Silas Grayson stood in the center of the yard, his face illuminated by firelight. Rage transformed his usually cold features into something almost feral. He held a pistol in one hand and a long blade in the other. "I know you're here," he shouted. "I know you did this." His eyes scanned the shadows, searching. Mama Edna stepped forward into the light. She moved slowly, limping badly, her body broken, but her posture somehow still defiant. Blood and dirt covered her torn clothing. Bruises darkened her ancient face. But her eyes held steady, meeting Silas's gaze without fear. Recognition flared in his expression. Then disbelief. "You! The old woman!" "Yes," Mama Edna said. Her voice came rough and cracked, but audible. "Me? Impossible. You should be dead. You should be—" "I killed them," Mama Edna interrupted. "The Graysons, Thomas, Eleanor, Henry. I poisoned them. I did it." Silas stared. His face worked through a series of emotions, shock, fury, something almost like grudging respect before settling back on pure hatred. "You murdered them. You admit it." "I freed us from them," Mama Edna corrected. "There is a difference. You're a murderer, a slave who killed her masters. Do you understand what that means?" "It means," Mama Edna said quietly, "that I finally did what should have been done 100 years ago." Silas raised the pistol, pointing it directly at her chest. "I should shoot you where you stand." "You should," Mama Edna agreed. "But you won't. You want to hurt me first. You want to make me suffer for making a fool of you." His finger tightened on the trigger, then loosened. She was right. "You're an abomination," Silas hissed. "A creature that should never have existed." "I am 103 years old," Mama Edna replied. "I have survived everything you people created. Every cruelty, every degradation. I outlived 3 generations of Grayson, and I have one final act left before I rest." Silas holstered the pistol and raised the blade instead. "Then let's end this properly." He charged. Mama Edna's hand went to the small pouch still hidden in her pocket, the last reserves of her mother's teaching. She pulled it free as Silas closed the distance. He was younger, stronger, faster, but she had patience, and timing, and nothing left to lose. When Silas came within arm's reach, blade raised to strike, Mama Edna threw the pouch directly into his face. The drawstring broke on impact. Powder exploded in a cloud of gray-yellow dust. Silas inhaled sharply in surprise. The powder filled his nose, mouth, lungs. He stumbled, suddenly choking. The blade fell from his grip. His hands went to his throat. The concentrated mixture, 10 times stronger than what she had scattered in the kitchen, went to work immediately. Silas's legs buckled. He crashed to his knees, wheezing and clawing at the ground. Mama Edna watched without expression as he convulsed. His body fought the poison, but fight was useless. The herbs paralyzed his lungs slowly, methodically, giving him time to understand what was happening. Silas looked up at her, eyes bulging, mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air. "You hunted a ghost," Mama Edna said softly. "Now the ghost hunts you." Silas's final breath left his body in a rattling wheeze. The fire had consumed the main stables completely. Flames still licked at support beams, sending sparks spiraling into the pre-dawn sky. Smoke hung thick across the plantation yard, transforming everything into ghostly shapes and shadows. But the chaos had ended. The horses had scattered into the surrounding woods. The patrollers lay incapacitated or fled. Silas Grayson's body remained where it had fallen, face down in the dirt, one hand still reaching toward the blade he never used. As the first pale light of sunrise touched the horizon, the formerly enslaved people gathered in a loose circle around Mama Edna. Their chains lay broken on the ground. Their faces showed exhaustion, terror, confusion, and something else, something fragile and new, hope. Ruth knelt beside Mama Edna, examining her injuries with gentle hands. The old woman sat propped against a fence post, breathing shallow and labored. Blood stained her clothing from wounds reopened during the confrontation. Her ancient body had finally reached its absolute limit. "We need to leave," Isaiah said quietly. His voice carried urgency, but not panic. "Before someone comes, before the authorities arrive and find—" He gestured at Silas's corpse, at the burning buildings, at the destruction surrounding them. "Yes," another man agreed. "They'll hang us all if they find us here." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. Fear remained their constant companion, even in victory. Ruth looked at Mama Edna. "Can you walk?" Mama Edna tried to push herself upright. Her legs trembled and gave out immediately. She slumped back against the post, breathing hard. "No," she whispered. "But you can. All of you can." "We're not leaving you," Ruth said firmly. Isaiah nodded. "We'll carry you if we have to." Around them, the others voiced agreement. After what Mama Edna had done, after she had given them this chance at freedom, abandoning her was unthinkable. "Then we need something to carry her on," Ruth said, already standing and scanning the yard. "A door, a board, anything flat and strong." Two younger men ran toward a damaged outbuilding and returned minutes later with a wooden gate torn from its hinges. They laid it carefully on the ground beside Mama Edna. Isaiah and Ruth lifted her as gently as possible, settling her onto the makeshift stretcher. She weighed almost nothing, her body reduced to bone and sinew after a century of deprivation. 4 people, 2 on each side, gripped the gate's edges. "North," Mama Edna murmured. "Follow the river north." "We know," Isaiah said softly. "We remember." The group moved out as the sun broke fully over the horizon, turning the smoke-filled sky shades of red and gold. They walked past the burning stables, past the main house where 3 generations of Graysons had ruled with cruelty, past the quarters where so many had suffered and died. They walked toward the tree line at the plantation's northern edge. Behind them, flames crackled and timbers collapsed. The Grayson plantation, symbol of generations of bondage, destroyed itself in fire and ash. Nobody looked back. The forest swallowed them quickly. Dense underbrush and tall pines provided cover from any potential pursuers. The group moved carefully but steadily, following game trails and natural clearings. Isaiah led the way, using the sun's position to maintain their northward bearing. Ruth walked beside the stretcher-bearers, occasionally checking Mama Edna's condition. The old woman's eyes remained closed most of the time, her breathing increasingly shallow. They traveled for hours. The morning heat built as they pushed deeper into the woods. Sweat soaked their clothing. Their bodies, weakened by years of inadequate food and brutal labor, protested every step. But they kept moving. Around midday, they reached a small clearing where a narrow stream cut through the forest floor. Isaiah called for a halt. The stretcher-bearers lowered the gate carefully, giving their aching arms relief. Ruth brought water to Mama Edna's lips. The old woman drank weakly, then opened her eyes. "Where?" she whispered. "Several miles north of the plantation," Isaiah said, kneeling beside her. "We're making good time." Mama Edna's gaze moved slowly across the gathered faces. Young and old, men and women, all watching her with expressions mixing gratitude and concern. "Keep going," she said. Her voice came barely audible. "Don't stop. Build new lives. Build families. Build something." She paused, gathering strength. "Build something better than what we left behind." "We will," Ruth promised, tears streaming down her face. "We will, Mama." "Tell them," Mama Edna continued. "Tell your children. Tell their children. Tell them what happened. Tell them an old woman finally said no. We'll tell them, Isaiah said. We promise. Mama Edna's hand reached up, trembling, and Ruth took it gently. The old woman's skin felt paper-thin and cold despite the summer heat. I see them, Mama Edna whispered. My mother, my husband, my babies. They're waiting. She smiled. A real smile, genuine and peaceful, transforming her battered face into something almost beautiful. Finally, she breathed. Finally, free. Her hand relaxed in Ruth's grip. Her chest rose once more, then fell, then stilled. Mama Edna, age 103, died peacefully in a forest clearing, surrounded by the people she had saved. Sunlight filtered through the pine branches above, dappling her still face with patterns of light and shadow. Ruth sobbed openly. Isaiah bowed his head. Around them, others wept or stood in shocked silence. They had lost their liberator, but they had gained their freedom. They buried her at the base of a massive oak tree near the clearing's edge. The tree's roots ran deep and strong, its branches spreading wide overhead. Isaiah said it reminded him of Mama Edna herself, ancient, enduring, sheltering. Using their hands and broken branches, they dug as deep as they could in the hard earth. They laid Mama Edna to rest, wrapped in Ruth's shawl, positioned carefully so she faced east toward the rising sun. Before covering her, each person placed something small in the grave: a smooth river stone, a wildflower, a carved piece of wood, tokens of remembrance and gratitude. Isaiah spoke simple words. You gave us tomorrow. We won't forget. They filled the grave and marked it with stones arranged in a pattern Mama Edna had once described from her African childhood, a circular design representing the eternal cycle of life. Then they continued north, carrying Mama Edna's memory with them. Years passed. The group scattered eventually, settling in different northern communities where Black people built lives away from the South's ongoing violence. They married, had children, told stories around fires and dinner tables, and always the story of Mama Edna spread. It traveled through churches and work camps, through family gatherings and secret meetings. The details shifted slightly with each telling, but the core remained constant. An old woman, over 100 years old, had brought a plantation to the ground and freed her people. Some said she used poison. Others said fire. Some claimed she used ancient magic passed down from Africa. All agreed she had waited a lifetime for justice, then seized it with both withered hands. The story became legend. The legend became hope. Hope became resistance. Decades later, in a small northern town, an elderly Black man sat on his porch with his great-granddaughter. The child, maybe 6 years old, played with a cloth doll at his feet. "Tell me a story, Grandpa," she said. The old man, whose name was Isaiah Jr., named for his grandfather, smiled. His face showed deep lines earned through a long life, but his eyes remained bright. "I'll tell you about Mama Edna," he said, "the one who rose at the end." The child listened, rapt, as Isaiah described a woman who had lived through unimaginable suffering yet never broke completely, who had pretended weakness while gathering strength, who had used her final days to destroy the system that had tried to destroy her. When he finished, the child asked, "Was she real?" Isaiah looked at his great-granddaughter, this beautiful child who would never know chains, never know auction blocks, never know the particular horrors that had shaped his grandfather's generation. "Real enough," he said softly, "to give you the life you got today." The child considered this seriously, then returned to playing with her doll. Isaiah watched her, thinking of his grandfather's stories, of Mama Edna's sacrifice, of all the blood and pain and resistance that had led to this moment. A Black child playing freely in the sunlight. Real enough, indeed. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.